Well, anyway, today we are talking about college football, believe it or not, now that we're several minutes in. Um, the subject today is how do we compare SEC, Big Ten schools, especially to the other conference schools, in this, especially because of all of the conference realignment, the SEC adding Texas and Oklahoma to the what was already the toughest conference in the country. I'm adding two really good programs. The Big Ten adding Oregon, Washington, USC, UCLA. Also, again, clearly the number two conference in the country, getting even stronger. Those are head and shoulders above the ACC and the Big 12, and obviously any of the Group of Five conferences at this point.
Yep.
And it's always been a bit of a separation in college football. It's always been a little bit interesting comparing schools, especially like resume wise. Like especially if you're talking about the playoff, comparing schools from those different conferences, because you can't just compare records. In the NFL, you kind of can compare teams based on their record, and it's a pretty accurate assessment. College football, it's a little more tricky, and it's getting even more tricky. For example, if this year Florida State goes 12-0 and Texas A&M goes 10-2, are those roughly equivalent? Like how do you compare those to each other?
Yeah.
It does an undefeated Power Four school just automatically go over a one-loss Power Four school, or how do you gauge that? I guess I have a few thoughts. I don't know that I have any concrete ideas. Where did your mind go, Ashton, when we talked about this as a topic, and like how do you expect that you will compare these teams that are in different conferences, clearly different strengths of schedules, even more so than other years?
Okay, so a couple of things, and you even touched on it a bit. In the NFL, you have divisions and
Mm-hmm.
conferences, right? And everything's divided up very neatly, and you can kind of sort teams according to that. When it comes, really, the only reason for sorting them is when it gets to postseason play, right? Trying to decide who gets to the playoff, who makes it, and who doesn't. And even in the NFL, you do have instances. I remember the NFC East for a while was like really, really bad, right? And like there would be a team that would make it that's 500 or a little below. I think there was an NFC West team maybe that was below 500 that made the playoff one year. It's very different, right? That doesn't happen very much. That's very everything in the NFL feels fairly even. You don't have many of those instances. You can remember them. In college, it is, like you said, way more difficult. We have a 12-team playoff, and we're going to have to make some judgments. Like there's going to be a lot of decisions that get made on, how good is this team? How do we compare this, right? Because we had a huge upheaval just in the last couple of months in, with realignment and the expansion to the playoff. So it's very interesting. Something we're gonna have to talk about a lot, I think. How do you compare? Because I do think it's a little bit subjective. It is. That's kind of what makes college football fun, is because it is a little bit like you can kind of believe whatever viewpoint you want to believe, even if it's just for a short amount of time. We don't have any evidence. We have no track record, right, of a 12-team playoff. We don't know what it looks like. You're right. Does a 9-3 SEC team get in over an 11-1 ACC team? What does that look like? How do we parse out the bids? Who gets selected to go to the playoff? It's a conversation that is upcoming, and I think we're talking about it pretty early on. But man, when we talked about this episode and getting into this, I just went ahead and started pulling up schedules, right?
Mm-hmm.
I looked at, teams like Texas. Texas just left the Big 12 to go to the SEC. Texas's schedule versus a team that stayed in the Big 12. Oklahoma State, very comparable, right? Texas and Oklahoma State have had they're fairly comparable programs just from the fact that they've had success. They're winning Big 12 programs. Texas obviously had a little bit more last year, but Oklahoma State has had a lot of success recently too. So you just kind of compare them and look at records and schedules. I think that's really the only way that I know how to do this. Like, because we don't at what little we do have to go on, because it's all there is. And yeah, trying to figure out how, Texas is a team that won the Big 12 last year. I think a lot of it's going to get decided on how does Texas fare in the SEC? Texas and Oklahoma go to the SEC, Washington and Oregon go to the Big Ten. How do they do? How does it work for them? 4 or 5 weeks, into league play. Like, how does that go? So I think that's where a lot of the judgment will get made. Maybe fair, whether it's fair or unfair. There's a lot of unknowns out there, and I think it makes it fascinating, really. Like, from our standpoint, we get to kind of dive in and talk about it. But yeah, I would start with probably schedule, and we're going to drastically overreact to the first couple of games that we get from those teams moving conferences, right? Like, do we just agree there that we're going to be just jump right out of the boat on that?
Everyone absolutely will. And you touched on one of the key points that was along one of the, I don't know how to say it, mental guidelines I've made for myself, I think, for this upcoming season, is it's less about comparing. You can't necessarily say, well, this team is from this conference, so I will view their record this way. You have to actually look at their individual schedule, because there are differences even among different conference teams. For example, compare Syracuse's schedule this year to, say, like Clemson's or something like that. Syracuse has an easy schedule, even though they are in the same conference as Clemson. That's one example, obviously, kind of pulled out of randomness. But the point is, when you're comparing Texas A&M and Florida State this year, compare their individual schedules. Don't just say this school is in this conference, this school is in this conference, and therefore that means 10 wins here equals 11 wins here. Now, over time, there will be some of that. Like, there will be a natural tendency. Okay, so on average, SEC schools are about 1 win worse than equivalent schools that are in the Big 12. One of the exercises I did was I took like the top 30 teams in Bill Connolly's SP Plus preseason rankings, and then I looked at what their FanDuel win total was. So basically, the SP Plus would tell you the quality of the team, regardless of what conference they're in, and then the FanDuel win total would tell you, how many games is this team supposed to win this year. And I mean, there's not a lot of major takeaways for me just from briefly looking at them. I didn't take the time to do the entire country. I just kind of did the top 30 teams in the country, which doesn't even have the group of 5 schools. And it's it's a little interesting to compare. There are a few notable things. Let's see, for example, Florida State projected to be the number 12 team in the country, projected to win 9.5 games. If you look just 2 spots lower at Oklahoma, Oklahoma's projected to be the number 14 team in the country, projected to win 7.5 games. And 1 spot above them, right in between them, is Texas A&M, projected to win 8.5. So you have Florida State, 9.5 wins, and then the 2 SEC schools underneath them, 8.5 and 7.5. Yeah, SP Plus would say these are all basically the same program as far as just the quality of the team.
Right.
But Florida State is going to win more games just because of their schedule, because of the conference they're in, you could argue. And then you have Tennessee a little bit lower, who's got a higher win total at 9.5, which is the same as Florida State. I didn't write down the juice on all these numbers. Obviously right now all the numbers are at 0.5, so you have heavy juice on the under, over, depending on the school. So we might have better data on this a couple months from now when we actually have whole numbers in some of these places. But I guess the point is, Vegas, as I look kind of down through the data, my best guesstimate is that Vegas says if you are in the SEC, you're going to win 1 fewer game than if you were in the Big 12 or the ACC. And even that is a difference, because the Big 12, I feel like, is more competitive. The Big 12 teams are going to win maybe 1 less game than the ACC, just because the ACC, it is a little more top heavy than the Big 12. The Big 12 has a meaty middle. I mean, this is something we've talked about the whole time. There's no great teams in the Big 12 necessarily, but man, there's a lot of really solid teams. That's a lot of rambling. What did I say that you agree with, and where am I missing the boat?
Well, I mean, I'm not sure if you're missing the boat anywhere. You're going off preseason SP Plus, which is, I mean, I think that's really, really good. That definitely factors in, like returning production, incoming talent, and so forth. And I think it's helpful. The FanDuel win totals is also helpful. just kind of all we're really trying to do is rank these conferences 1 through 4. Like that's all we're really trying to do. It's, in whatever order, you think that it's going to end up in. However, we're also trying to find what's the difference between 1 and 2, and what's the difference between 2 and 3 and 3 and 4. So I think it's a very difficult conversation, and it's one that people aren't having yet. I don't think that conversation is in the mainstream of college football media yet, but he's going to have to be here shortly, because there's no doubt we keep coming back to Florida State, and Florida State is maybe it's a little bit of an easy one to pick on because they did go undefeated last year and got left out anyway, before realignment. Think about that. That's a Florida State team that went undefeated and got left out before the realignment happened, and before the SEC got tougher and the Big Ten got tougher. So yeah, it was already that way. ACC and the Big 12 were not as good as the SEC and Big Ten, but I do have a hot take, and you just see if you agree with it. You can disagree with it. That's fine. The SEC is one. We're not even. I don't think anyone's even debating that. I think even Big Ten fans would tell you that the SEC is the best conference out there. That's not really. We're shelving that one. I think that the Big Ten is 2. However, I think that the Big Ten is far closer to the Big 12 at 3 than they are to the SEC at 1. And the reason I say this, the Big Ten has a very, very strong top of their conference. We have Ohio State, Oregon, Michigan, Penn State, right? We really like those teams. And then there's a bit of a drop and you talked about the Big 12 you called it a meaty middle. There's a bunch of really, really solid teams that could kind of beat anyone in that conference. There's a lot of depth, I guess is what we're saying. But, they add a team like Utah. So, yeah, the Big 12 also expanded here. And I do think that the Big Ten, while I would still have the Big Ten as number 2, but I do think they're actually closer to the Big 12 at 3 than what they would maybe care to admit.
I think I would zag on you a little bit. It also depends a little bit on how you're trying to compare these. If you're comparing 1 through 14 or however many teams you have in your conference, it's a little more. The Big 12 does have a good middle, like it really does. They absolutely cannot compete with the Big 10 at the top. There are 4 programs in the Big 10 that would all be a heavy favorite to win the Big 12 if they were in the Big 12. And it's a pretty decent gap if you're talking like Penn State down to Utah and Kansas State. Like there is a gap there, at least as far as all the computer rankings would tell you. I mean, we've been using SP Plus, but there's lots of other good computer rankings out there you can look up. And even Vegas too. They would tell you that the ceiling of the Big 10 is quite a bit higher than the Big 12. If you're comparing like the median team, like the middle team in each conference, then it's way more comparable, because the Big 12, this has been a talking point all offseason. There's like 10 teams that feel like they can win the Big 12 this year. There's only 4 or so that can win the Big 10. It's just a little more spaced out. I guess I would view it a little differently, because the SEC does have the high ceiling like the Big 10, and they do have the good depth. Like the SEC is clearly better at both. I would tend to. I think I would still say the Big 10 is probably closer to the SEC than the Big 12. It's a little bit semantics. I mean, the Big 10 is clearly the number 2 conference. I think the Big 12 is clearly number 3 right now, just because of that depth, even though Florida State and Clemson would be favored to win the Big 12. But that's 2 teams instead of 4, and the rest, like it is a little weaker in the ACC. I do think like SMU, say what you want, like they do help the ACC, a little bit. And if the ACC could claim Notre Dame, they would probably jump the Big 12. Obviously Notre Dame is just a partial member. Notre Dame, by the way, ranks higher in preseason SP Plus than any ACC team or any Big 12 team. They're kind of in a weird spot, like all by themselves.
Yeah.
They are one of 5 programs that has a win total of 10.5 in the preseason. The other four are all at the top: Georgia, Ohio State, Oregon, and Texas. Those are the top four teams in the country per SP plus. Notre Dame, you have to drop down all the way to number 9, and they're also at 10.5. That's just a factor of the schedule. Like, they have a very ACC schedule this year. That's what it looks like if you look at their schedule. It looks like an ACC team.
Yeah, that's fair, and your point with the Big 12 is well taken. I'm not saying that the Big 10 is falling down to the Big 12's level. I just think that they're closer maybe to the Big 12 than the talking points out there, because there is the talk of the two mega conferences, which is kind of becoming true. I think
Money wise, it's already true.
In money wise, it's already happened, right?
Yeah.
It's just, I think from the performance on the field standpoint, the Big 10 is not light years away. If you would do, a Big 10 versus Big 12 challenge, the Big 12 might win that thing outright. You know what I'm saying? Like when you put it like that, like if you'd match up those teams, I think the middle of the Big 12 can absolutely play with the Big 10. And I think the bottom of the Big 12 is considerably better than the Big 10. That's what we are into semantics at this point. But the ACC is the one here who's interesting, and something I wanted to get into on this point. Florida State, they've been a talking point. We could compare Clemson too if we want to, but I do have Florida State stuff up in front of me right now. But you compare Florida State's schedule with Florida's schedule, and it's so different. Like, it's just light years different. Not just from what they are doing in conference, but also out of conference too. Like, it's not fair. Florida has a very, very difficult schedule. And Florida State's is, just considerably easier. So, like, when we do compare, say we get to the end of the season and Florida, like, they will play each other. That's the nice thing. They do get to play each other. Thanksgiving weekend there. And I don't, like, how do you compare those teams? Like
it's
what
really
makes
hard.
them what makes them equal? Because we don't have great points. The Florida, just to touch on this, Florida is out of conference. They get Miami at home and UCF at home. Those are tricky teams, by the way. The war for Florida this year is going to be difficult. UCF is no pushover. They're not. UCF is a good football team, and Miami is, they're going to start out ranked. Like, Miami's going to start out as a ranked team probably.
By the way, KJ Jefferson is a UCF, for those that are not aware of that. Like, they are.
Yeah. No, UCF is solid. I think they're maybe a little, kind of flying under the radar. So they play UCF, Miami, and Florida State all in the non-con. This is Florida that we're talking about, the Gators. They're playing all of those teams in the non-con. They have a brutal SEC schedule on top of that. So if Florida somehow manages to go 9-3, let's say they lose to Georgia, Texas, and let's say they lose to Ole Miss. They're losing to the number 1, the number 4, and I'm not sure where Ole Miss was. And Ole Miss is probably going to start out in the top 5, not in SP plus, but in the actual rankings. Ole Miss is going to be very highly rated, right? If, say, they go 9-3, they would have some impressive wins on there. Florida is probably a playoff team. You know what I'm saying? Like, Florida, you pretty much have to put Florida in there, because they would be beating teams like Miami, A&M, Tennessee, Kentucky. They'd have to beat Florida State and LSU in this scenario to go 9-3, right? That would be a very, very impressive string of wins for them. And then how do you compare that to Florida State, who might be 11-1, having only lost to Florida in this scenario and they beat Notre Dame. So how does that compare? Who would you put in that scenario? A 9-3 Florida team or an 11-1 Florida State team? I think it's really interesting, and you'd probably have to. There's no doubt that Florida would have the better resume.
So here's another thing that I think a lot of college football fans lose sight of a little bit. It not only matters who you beat, who you lose to, it matters how you do it. Say what you want. You beat Duke by 30. That's more impressive than beating North Carolina by 5. Like, it's just, back in the BCS days, they had this thing where, they didn't want to offend the delicate sensibilities of college football players. So they took out the computer rankings that included margin of victory because they didn't want to incentivize running up the score, you know.
Right. Right.
Never mind that margin of victory is actually a really important thing. Like it's not just in who you beat, it's in how you do it. And one of the other, I guess, rules for myself that I'm going to have more going forward when I'm looking at resumes is I am going to utilize things like SP plus and F plus, FEI. Like I'm going to utilize computer rankings more probably for resume purposes than I ever have. Before I've tended to use it just to see, you know, what's the quality of the team. You kind of have to use that more now for resume just because the quality of the team matters because there is more of a difference in the schedules than there used to be. And yeah, I'm just going to use computer rankings more than I ever have before.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I think it's going to be so much on the individual to make it, to make these decisions to make these judgments. I guess we'll call them judgments. But I think a lot will be put on these out of conference games early on. And I think maybe too much. I think we might put too much weight on some of the non-conference games because it's the only data points that we have, and we're going to be just desperate for data points, right? Like we're going to be trying to find, anything we can to properly rank these teams. And maybe just maybe the Florida Miami game will carry a little too much weight, in our SEC versus ACC battle. So I think it's interesting. Is there a possibility? And just give me some rope here. Just kind of this is just a loose theory. Clemson back in the day, it felt like when they were matching up with Alabama every year in the championship that Clemson would just roll through. They'd roll through the ACC. It was kind of weak then, right? It was never strong, not what the SEC was, but I mean, it wasn't even close. Alabama would have to slog their way through the SEC and they'd meet up. And Clemson, it seemed like they were usually quite healthy, peaking at the right time. They didn't have to, it felt like they didn't have to strain through all of the schedule, right? And they would often show up and get after people in the postseason, right? Like they won a couple of championships and they blew out Alabama one time, which doesn't happen. So is there a world where the ACC figures this out, where let's say, Clemson and Florida State, reel off a lot of victories, right? And they meet and, they have a fairly close ACC championship game and maybe they both get to go, to a 12 teamer. Is there a world where they're set up very, very well for success versus some of the Big Ten and SEC teams that are just, like the Florida example, right? Like they've had to play tough teams every week. Is there a world where that sets them up very well because they did get to kind of feast on the cupcakes a little bit?
Maybe. Also, Florida State and Clemson probably aren't going to be in the ACC for very long, so that's a whole different aspect to it. But
I'm saying this year, like for this year, though.
Maybe like you might have a point. It's very possible that the SEC teams that emerge from the chaos are a little more banged up than your Florida States and Clemsons and Notre Dame or Utah or whoever else is in there. Yeah, that's one thing to consider. By the way, just what you mentioned was it's going to be on the individual to make decisions. Like, is it not a little terrifying that the committee has to be, in a way, even more subjective now? Like, in a way, you could argue that going to a 12-team playoff is almost an insurance policy from the committee, and they're sometimes questionable decision making. Like, for example, 12-0 Florida State is going to the playoff this year. Like that will happen.
We think so? Yeah.
Because they have to. Like they're you can't leave an undefeated Power Force program out of a 12-team playoff. Like there's just no way that can happen. Partially because they do the stupid automatic qualifying thing and all that, but
yeah.
Regardless, like if this was still a 4-team playoff and these committee members had to determine between the 12-1 ACC champion and a 10-2 Alabama team that didn't make it to the SEC title. Like, man, I'm just glad that we're not giving that level of power to the committee because of the weird nature now of the schedule. My ultimate would still be 8 at-larges and that's it. But and so then it would all be up to the committee. But anyway,
I still think they'll screw this up. I mean, I think that they will be full on Mario Cristobal with the timeouts screwing this thing up. Like, well, I don't think that they're very capable of I mean, it gives them more chances. Just like the math of it is like, well, we now have to make 12 correct decisions. They couldn't even make 4. So yeah,
this is why the committee needs to have access to some better computer rankings like SP Plus, like FEI, and others out there.
That, though they have it.
I don't know if they use the good ones. I think maybe they use FPI.
they probably use FPI. I would agree. I mean, yeah, there's the FPI thing is a joke. They're terrible. They should just take it down. It's hard to watch. Yeah, no, in some ways I agree with you. It is, yeah, it's very interesting. It's going to cause a lot of hand wringing, I think, early on. And I think it's just going to be important just to let it play out. We're going to get to make the judgments on these conferences and these teams, but just let's not put so much weight on the week 1 matchup.
Sure.
Like let's just give it a little time. If Georgia comes out and blitzes Clemson in week 1, which could happen, by the way, Georgia does that to people. If Georgia does that, let's not just throw the ACC in the trash completely.
Yeah.
Like, can we just reserve judgment a little bit? So yeah, let's make these decisions at the end of the year, and hopefully, really, what we need to do like a watch party for all the committee members, just to make sure that we know that they are watching all these games, because it feels like they're not. It feels like they don't watch most of these games, and they just text Herbie at the end like, "Who do you want in there?" And Herbie's like, "Put Bama in there," and then they do. Like, that's kind of what it felt like.
Yeah, so I don't know how long we can keep this up. I mean, we'll talk about this more as the season goes along. We just want to do one episode where we kind of talked about the challenge of this, because it is a challenge more so than even previous years when we did have separation between the SEC and the ACC and the Big 12. Like there has always been a difference from conference to conference. It's clearly more pronounced this year, and that does make the records a little funky. So yeah, there's a few different aspects, a few different guiding principles maybe you can use, but it is just going to be a little bit weird.